Let me go and double check if Mark or Joshua are around. Hey, Mark.
Hey, Rob. All right. It's 5 minutes after the hour. Hi, everyone. Again, as the usual reminder that actually, Mike, what is the spiel that you usually give?
This meeting's being recorded. It'll be uploaded to YouTube shortly thereafter. And your participation in this meeting is an agreement to abide by the OpenSSF Code of Conduct.
Thanks. I'll try to remember that. I feel like every time I try it, I mess it up. Okay, I see. Sean also added something to the agenda. I'll just move it down. I think I see Sean here. I'll move it down to the list of agenda items. If there's any other agenda items, please add it to the list. And also, please remember to check into the meeting notes. I'll put it in the. Oh, a bunch of people have already pasted the meeting notes. So if you could check in, that would be appreciated. I wanted to call out I created a pull request linked in the doc number 486 that creates a new 1.0 directory. I could just present it now, just so folks can see in case anyone has an opinion. I just need 1 or 2 reviews on it to be able to get it submitted. So here's the preview. It doesn't show up by default. You have to specifically type the URL, like change the URL to v1.0 to find it. I have this warning banner at the bottom. Actually, in the preview, it doesn't really. Here we go. It conflicts with the Netlify thingy down here. So there we go, gone. This little thing, if you have thoughts on what that looks like, if that's sufficient to note that it's the unpublished draft, that would be good. And it says draft in the name and like the little version picker. So if we go to like security levels, it says 1.0 draft over here. And then some implementation stuff. So if anyone could review that, that would be appreciated. And then once we have that, I think we could start sending pull requests to actually address issues for 1.0. And my feeling is that being that we have this banner and that it's not linked to by default, it's fine to just serve it. And then anyone who wants to look at the latest draft can just go to the website. Okay.
Where did you say the link for that was? Is it in the notes?
It's in the notes doc, yeah. Uh, yeah. I don't know if there's another better use of. I also just want to remind folks to like go through. I saw a flurry of activity right before the meeting on some 1.0 issues, but to go through and offer any opinions on any of the 1.0 issues. Should we switch to Sean's question about the DISI envelope spec?
Yeah, so that stems from my surprise at seeing the spec, and after having seen, well, mostly in toto attestations with DISI envelopes that contain the certificates, that it wasn't in the spec. And then I noticed there's actually this pull request that I know, Mark, you've had some back and forth on this. It seems like, one, it's already common practice to be doing this, and two, it just seems like a good idea to be able to distribute the certificate alongside it, because it's, you know, people distribute the GPG signatures alongside things and you have to go digging for the keys. Whereas this gives you a verifiable path back to a trusted source for the key that's signed the attestation. So I think it just makes it terribly convenient to at least do a verification of the attestation if the certificate is present. But I'd hate to see this get bogged down in the devil is the details, because I think it's just really useful.
So I had thought this was already in there, because I thought in the DISI envelope markdown, it does say, you know, you can include the key along with the signature. Oh, sorry, the key ID. I see.
Yeah, so there's a key ID in there at the moment, but no certificate.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks. To be honest with you, as a reviewer, I add my comments and then I just kind of evict it from my memory, and I wait for the author to ping it. But I'll ping the author to see if she can update the some of these things. And if we want to defer some changes to a future pull request, I'm fine with that too. But I think the ball was in her court next. So let me, I'll set a reminder to do that right now.
Okay, perfect. If there's anything I can do to help out with that, then feel free to let me know. But I think it's a super useful thing to have.
Agreed. Yeah, let me ask Asra and see if she wants to do that, and if she's not interested, then we could just copy the pull request and make changes again. But I'm assuming most of the issues should be pretty quick to fix. Sounds good. Thanks for reminding. I think there's also one around this. This is actually related to the cosign has their own like envelope format that has, I think, the certificate, but also I think like the timestamp authority or like the timestamp thingy. That one would be another one that we could add a field to. I think we just need someone with a concrete, like concrete use cases. Like this is actually what's going to go there in the formats and stuff. Because like I could take a guess, but I've never done it before, so I don't know, what the needs are, like how it should be formatted.
Yeah, I think the only real use case for having the timestamp is so that you can compare the timestamp of a signature against the timestamp of a revocation of the certificate. So for an example, Microsoft uses in Authenticode to make sure that code keeps running if the signature was valid at the time that the certificate was valid. And if you, latterly invalidate the certificate, your code will keep running, and you've got a window where you can at least go and get freshly signed bits. So I think that's the use case that I've seen for the timestamp. But yeah, it's a useful potential addition, but I think it should be optional.
Sounds good. And I guess I could give one other quick update on what was it? On the changes to 1.0. I started implementing the changes from the proposal in order to talk about like split the levels. I could show what I have now. It's still like, I had to stop. My workday ended like in the middle of like writing a paragraph, and I haven't touched it since. So it's like totally extremely draft right now, but I can share what I have so far just to kind of hopefully get people moving. So one thing I wanted to ask was, like, I need to name these things, like what are all the different sets of things? And so I said tracks. I thought maybe that's a decent name. Like salsa levels are split into tracks, and each track has its own set of levels that measure a particular aspect of security. So there's a build track and a source track. So the build track is what we have here. I'll replace all this text with some better writing. That was one of the to-dos. And the source track, I still not written. Any thoughts one way or the other, early feedback?
Yeah, I was just looking at the GitHub issue, I forget the number, where we're discussing whether or not to defer the source levels for 1.0. So is the idea that there will be sort of a source draft for 1.0 that isn't officially part of it, or should we just not mention source at all?
I think the I think the feedback we got on the original doc was that it would be valuable to somehow tell the reader that we expect this to be coming soon, but that the details aren't finalized.
Okay.
Yeah, Mike?
Yeah, so something to put a pin in for this particular thing, and if we have time later on in this meeting, I do want to talk about is I do think even if we don't have necessarily a draft of what the source requirements are going to be or whatever by 1.0, I think we still need to have a clear definition of what source is for 1.0, because that specific thing like source and dependencies and some of the other things are still fairly contentious as to what it actually means. And I think that should be made clear in that document at the least.
Sounds good. I'm just trying to write up a note. So tentatively, yes, we'll define the sort track. Let's say it's need to better. Definitely. And in general, like the model page, like the term, where is it? Can't find it. I want to fully flesh that out. Or like right now we define build, but we don't have like a link for source. That I think that could naturally go in there. Package as well. There was some other OpenSSF work on defining the term package. I think one of the other working groups, I forget who was starting that. So I think that would be good to like have consistent terminology around like what is a package. There's also the notion of when we have like an OS distribution maintains a package and like they import their source into their own repo and then add their own package, etc. I think that all ideally would be described in the terminology section, so we have a model for how that all works.
Well, good luck getting some consistency on that, especially if you involve the Perl folks.
Yeah. I know that there are a couple of other groups out there, like OWASP and some others that have potentially defined some of these things already. So it might be something that at least we can look at as prior art.
I don't think you'll be able to define a terminology that everybody will, find that works for them, but you can at least define one for yourself and say, this is how we use those terms. So I think Mark is on the right track anyway.
Yeah, because even the word package, I think, is quite ambiguous.
Yeah.
Like, does that mean the actual file? Does that mean the name? And effectively, there's multiple versions of that. Is that a sub thing within it, and the whole thing is like a module, and there's packages within modules? So we just need to come up with, just define it up front.
So I will say from the SPDX side, a package is supposedly a collection of one or more files. Now, it's interesting because the difference between source and package there would be whether it depends upon what you are distributing. So in the end, the package is anything that you are distributing or hosting or in any way sharing with someone else. If that helps the conversation.
Yeah, I think the also package. Also SPDX and maybe OWASP. It said have definitions. Yeah. I think
Also,
ideally we have terms that are just like that. Most people read it and don't get the wrong impression. And so, yeah, I think my guess is it might be good to avoid the. Anyway, well, we get into that into the actual pull request. Maybe it's not the best use of time here.
yeah, I mean, I like the idea of just like trying to define what the thing actually does or where it's being used or the properties of it, rather than focus on the name. For example, Cyclone DX doesn't use the word package at all. They just use component. So I don't think it matters what name you pick, but it's to be clear of what the properties are.
Agreed. So we don't have a large agenda today. I think we could either, I don't know the best way to use time. We also have what, 16 people here, so I want to use our time wisely. If other folks have thought, oh, Mike.
Oh, I mean, I think the one thing that I would, if we had the time, and I know it's another sort of definition thing here, but us to kind of, I think, at least try and sort out a little bit of the dependencies and materials and source discussion, just so that like we can potentially disambiguate like what it means in the requirement. In the requirements.
Wouldn't that be part of the source discussion?
I'm not sure. What do you mean?
So I thought for 1.0 that we're not going to focus on source. So I'm trying to understand the
Oh,
question.
no, not for the source requirements. Sorry, I said this. The requirements that say like you must specify the source. Like what is even a source? What is even a dependency? I think we just need to make sure that we're a little bit more clear about it. Even if that thing is anything that is a dependency is a source, and anything that's a source is a dependency. Even if we just kind of come to that conclusion, I don't care. It's just, I think we need to make sure that we are just very clear about it, because a lot of folks are getting confused about, like, especially if multiple source code repositories make up one eventual artifact. Are they all considered the source? Now I no longer have a single way of specifying the source like I could, like just a commit ID. And then the same thing with dependencies, right? Like if I'm pulling third-party code, is that dependencies? Is that the source? I think there's there's been a lot of confusion from folks about what that means. And then, as I think even Sean had sort of mentioned, is like, can we even really make the distinction between, even a packaged binary as a dependency? Isn't that also just part of what is being built and packaged?
Got it. Okay, so kind of like, if I can say it in a different way, can a direct dependency be considered a source because it is required, versus a transitive dependency may not necessarily be source?
Well, I think the thing here is actually more just about the definition, right? Like it's going to be hard for us to define source requirements if we don't have a clear definition of what source means. But yeah, that's potentially one of the things there. Sean.
Yeah, I think this is complicated. When you think about most build systems, you end up with you start with a piece of source, you start with a build script, and you have all the dependencies that have to be there in order for the build script to succeed with the source. But then there are build systems like, well, it's not so bad now, but it used to be like the OpenJDK, where before you could even start, I guess Qt6 is probably similar, in that before you start, there are a whole range of different pieces of source code you have to gather together before you can start doing it. And each one of those individually could be considered a source. So you've got different ways of looking at these things, and we need to try and encompass as many as we can. But, my personal definitions are that, the source is what is acted upon. The build script is the actor, and the transitive dependencies are things that are essentially passive in the build system itself, but need to be there in order for the build to complete. So, that's kind of how I categorize them and how we categorize them at active state. But it's, I think it's highly subjective, and it's one of those things that potentially could end up being a bit of a flame war.
Yeah, I think, so can you repeat what you just said, or type it in here, just so we have like a proposal? I think basically we just need, well, I think that's similar to, in spirit, to what I had in the first post of number 129, but if you could write what you said, that'd be great. I think in terms of, so I had proposed in terms of inputs, I think there is and we'll see if this agrees with Sean, the build configuration, which is, let me try to also add another bullet here where you type build configuration, build parameters, source. So like the build configuration would be like the config as code of the build system. For example, in GitHub Actions, this would be the workflow definition file. the .github/workflows/whatever. Build parameters would be kind of like ephemeral or like over the wire things that are set per build. Like for example, if you invoke GitHub Actions has a thing where you could like have like an input box to type an arbitrary string. You have actions. And I think Sean also mentioned like, then there's everything else that's needed to run the build. I think dependencies are maybe there's kind of a blend between source dependencies and environment. I had been thinking, I think we may have a definition here. Environment is like the things that are on the machine that like the user didn't pick. So for example, in GitHub Actions, that would be like the VM that's set up. And that there's different versions of that and we should record that, but it's not like arbitrary things. It's kind of chosen by the build system and maybe you pick among a choice of them, but you're not just grabbing arbitrary artifacts. Dependencies would be things that are needed during the build that are not actually the code itself, like libraries, tools, etc. Anything that's kind of fetched over the wire. And then that leaves a weird spot for source, because like, how do you tell the difference? From the build system's perspective, the build configuration is clear because it read it, so it knows what it read. But then differentiating between sources and dependencies is sometimes there's like a trigger for the source of like, you know, whenever you see a commit on this repo, do this. And usually the action is to fetch that source and build it. But there's no guarantee that, for example, a GitHub Actions workflow actually builds that same repo. It could fetch a different repo and build it entirely. So I don't really know how that plays in. Anyway, we'll see too. I think Nisha had her hand up.
Mike had his hand up first, so I'll let him go.
Okay. Yeah, I'll go real quick. Yeah, so one of the things that I know, if we look at some of the like prior art out there, like Nix and Gwix and how they've sort of done this in the past, they don't make any distinction between like the literal source code and dependencies, because they pretty much argue that you can't make that distinction. But they do make a distinction between build dependencies and dependencies that are either included in the artifact or are runtime dependencies. And then another thing that they do, which is something that I don't think we can do, but they essentially view like if you do have a package as a dependency, something that would be like a binary or whatever, you don't rely on the binary directly, similar to Bazel and a lot of those other Pants and a lot of those other build tools. You actually rely on the build definition of that package. And so there is like a potential there for, is there the option for somebody to say, hey, I rely on this SLSA attestation, which defines my dependency? I don't know. I think we probably couldn't do that generally because we're trying to say SLSA is not transitive. But I wonder if that's just an option that helps simplify things for some people. Nisha?
Yeah, I wonder if it's easier to just call everything that goes into a build inputs, and maybe make a distinction between inputs and configuration. But I wonder if might be easier for the specification to say that, to use inputs as a generic term and not distinguish any further. That way, you do not have to make a distinction between inputs that you know of, which can include source code and direct dependencies, and inputs that you don't know of, which may include transitive dependencies and things that are being fetched over the wire. And probably put all the things like configuration files and environment variables as configuration in general, or settings, something like that. Yeah, so maybe use some generic terms there.
Yeah, I think at a technical level, you can say that that all inputs are equal. The build system, some build systems might disagree, but you could just call them all dependencies and say that everything that comes in order to build the artifact that comes out is a dependency. But I think in real world usage that might come off as a little confusing if we can't say as a group that I've downloaded the source distribution for URL lib3 and I've built URL lib3.whl as a wheel, that I can't point at the original source distribution and say that's the source. If I can just say, well, no, that's just another dependency. You could say, well, you've got the Python core, you've got your bzip2 libraries, you've got everything that's a dependency. That's part of that build closure comes in as, if they all come in as inputs on equal standing, it's difficult for us to say in the provenance that, or it's difficult for us to draw a clear line in the provenance between the source code and the artifact. So I think it's important for us to be able to identify at least one or a set of files as the initial source, and then everything else as things that have either been constructed or contributed around that source as dependencies. I think it's important to be able to draw a clear line between the source code and the bits. So that's kind of what we're trying to do, is give you that chain of custody between the source code that the author produced and the bits that are finally delivered to you.
But that's probably a distinction between what you know and what you can control, what you control and what you can't control. So source is the input that you control, and everything around it is stuff that you can't, inputs that you can't control. So there's a hierarchy over there, dependent on the thing that you have created, like the person who had authored all the files, the stuff that the author has created, and the stuff that the author has reused. So maybe I'm just trying to figure out, there may be a hierarchy of nomenclature that might be useful here in explaining what you would need for what the specification defines as source.
Yeah, I think the argument over control depends a lot on where you sit in the chain of custody. So, for example, if you're author, you have control over what we might consider to be the source. But if you're GitHub or someone who's building the source, you probably have more control over the dependencies that are put in than you do over the source code.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just putting these terms out there, so maybe there's we can create a framework around how we define these terms for the specification.
Yeah, and I think that's why it's important we make these distinctions if we can.
Mark, you had your hand up?
Yeah, I think well, I have two comments. One, I tend to agree with. I think, if I understand you, Sean, I think you're basically in agreement, if I understand correctly, and I think I agree that from a technical level, because I'm coming at this from what can a build system guarantee when the tenant, the user, is writing the build script and can do arbitrary things. And it sounds like there is value, and I think this matches what we had said briefly. There's value in identifying something nominally as the source, even if there's no real technical control to know like that is the actual thing that was compiled as like the top level program, versus some other artifact was actually it. And so build systems, I guess there would be a requirement that they do identify that thing, and there doesn't have to be a technical control, because we can't possibly think of one what that would be. Sounds like. My other comment is on the meaning of dependencies. And I think this is also, again, why I wanted to find this in the docs. I think what we mean here, transit versus like direct dependencies, I think is a little bit confusing. It is all the things that were needed during the build time dependencies. And if it was needed during the build, it's there. If it's not needed during the build, it's not. So for example, if you have a container image as a dependency, then you just leave the container image, but not the things that were in the container image. Or if you have like vendored source code where you've checked in a library into a Git repo, you would just list the Git repo and not all of the subdirectories that are found within the Git repo. So it's, yeah, I think that's how we mean it. And then docs should more clearly express that.
So I had two things. One is we really need to choose a point of view, because I heard Sean saying, you know, like from a GitHub perspective, right? The build system wouldn't necessarily have control over the source. But if we want to take the point of view of build, then we should state that versus the people actually creating the code or using the code. So is it a person or is it a system point of view? Because if you don't define which point of view, your definition of something is going to constantly change, as whether it's like, you know, producer or consumer or like a system, right? So I think we need to choose a point of view. And then for the transitive and direct dependencies, I think of it as if I call Homebrew as an example to install Python, my direct dependency, I'm calling for Python. I'm not calling for all the other junk that gets installed, right? But it's needed to run. So those would be transitive because they weren't defined, but what was defined was Python. So that's, I think, what I'm thinking in terms of direct versus transitive. Direct is something that you clearly define in your code. And then everything else that may be a prereq, right, that you might not have defined would be considered transitive. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think we're muddling some things up here a little bit, in that there are build time dependencies, and build time dependencies can be direct and transitive, and then runtime dependencies as well, which are only required actually when you come to use the artifact that you've got. So for example, you might need, if you're building something with building a Python module, you might need the Python core and all of its dependencies, plus setup tools, wheels, toml, some of those packages. You need all those at build time, but then you might need something else at runtime. Things at runtime, I don't think we really care about right now. Those are more the area of the package manager, because the package manager needs to make sure that when it's installing artifacts, the runtime closure is complete. But at build time, we only need to know about the build closure. So yeah, so you could say, I need setup tools in order to build. Setup tools needs, that's a direct dependency. Setup tools needs Python, and Python needs bzip too, and those are transitive dependencies. But those are part of the build closure and not necessarily part of the runtime closure.
Correct. Yeah, because I mean, I think of like OEM code or let's say we use a Red Hat image, right? We're calling that image and it's a direct dependency, but whatever that Red Hat image needs to download, we wouldn't call, right? And so that's why, regardless of whether it's during build, right, or not, something that you explicitly state, I need this. And everything else, it has to get pulled in, because in order to get that needed object, it goes and pulls that other information, even during build.
So I think what complicates that then is the only dependency that would be included would literally be the build config. So that would, because everything else could be inferred from the build config. But then I think the problem there is we also run into the issue of if everybody's not completely pinning all their dependencies by hash, then you potentially lose all of that other useful metadata about like what what versions of what packages and what hashes of what packages you end up with.
But isn't that method by which you could make an assessment on the build? So a build that has, like a build definition that has more explicit information is a higher quality build than a build that has less of it. So like even if you were to point to just one configuration file, that's still a definition of a build. It's just not rich enough for you to make a reasonable assessment about the build, and hence you could call it a not that high quality build.
I guess, in terms of, so maybe let me try to recap what we just discussed first to see if we're on the same page about the proposal. In terms of inputs to the build, we have like the build config. Well, first of all, people agree like there's a build configuration that the build system actually reads and knows this was the thing I actually read, which is sometimes the same as the source and sometimes different. And then all the stuff that the build script required, which could be broken up into the source, the nominal source that was being built, and like declared or direct dependencies, and transit or indirect dependencies that kind of came along as part of that, and that there's no way for the build system to really differentiate between those three, source versus direct versus indirect dependencies, but that it could be useful for downstream systems. And so the kind of the build script or the tenant of the build system can add that information as like FYI. Does that recap what is being discussed?
I think so. I think the only thing that is still kind of a little ambiguous is I remember us having earlier on months and months and months ago, like some discussions about how do we also make sure that it is like some of the information that we're including inside of a SLSA attestation is also for downstream systems to potentially consume. And even if, let's say, a lot of this additional metadata can be inferred from the source, and by the source, I mean like the build config itself, if folks do not have access to the build config, because let's say it's the vendor build config, but the vendor wants to tell you, hey, I'm not giving you access to my actual build, but I am telling you, or at least I'm making claims about what I built. and what dependencies I used, what source code I used, and whatever, so that if I ever get audited, I can show you that. I wonder if there's any just general concerns about that.
So I think that maybe something that you could probably get the build system to provide for you. So maybe not something that you would know in advance, but at least like the build system would be able to give you some of that information, and then you can make an assessment on the build system in that way. So there's I mean, I guess my point is that it's not necessarily about how much how much information you want to explicitly put into the specification, but you can make it, you can make it such that if more information needs to be added, it can be added.
You mean like in the spec, like in the schema of the provenance?
Yeah. So the way that, like for example, you could create references to other provenance statements that a build system may create for you. So you create one provenance statement, the build system, and then you can say like, okay, here's a placeholder for the stuff that the build system creates. And then the build system says, okay, this is all the things that I know of. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, I'd be concerned about a build system that didn't know about all of its inputs.
I think that's most,
I mean,
that's most build systems today, right? Like besides like Nix and Active State and like the handful of and Bazel based ones and a handful of ones that do like all the work of fully specifying. I think the state of the art for most, well, maybe the state of the art's the wrong word, but most software today is built without that like that detailed information and being verified. So I'm still not sure what the use case is for declaring direct versus indirect dependencies. That I would like to work out before making that a requirement. But since we only have a few minutes left, in terms of the actual levels and requirements, where does this put us? What should be required at what level? I think listing all of the dependencies will, I think I already have agreement here, will not be required at build level 3, because like that was previously required at SLSA 4. It's too big of a jump to ask to do at level 3. So I think that's out. Right now, I don't remember where the build configuration is required, if it's at level 2 or 3. And the question is, where should the source go? Mike?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that was one of the things that was brought up about like what counts as materials. What counts as source there, right? Like there is, at some point, there is some build that's saying to do a thing. And I think this is the thing where it keeps going back to what is practical versus like, clearly if you have a build config and you are also capturing the inputs to that build config, if there are external inputs, then you know what the source is going to be, right? Because that build config would go and say, okay, download this thing, download these dependencies, whatever. So I think we have that, but I think that there's still an element of, yeah, but like, it's still useful to have that additional information, right, for folks. And some people might want to specify that additional information so that people can go back and say, hey, there are certain types of packages I know I do not want, or there's certain types of things in my SLSA thing that based on a policy I know I don't want, or whatever. Or we could just say, keep it very generic and just say whatever the build config is should capture enough information to do the rebuilding, and just leave it at that. And everything else that kind of goes from there. Another practical thing is potentially just some way of capturing the entire build environment as a hash of some sort. I think a few folks had talked about potentially saying, hey, if I have a container, if I take a snapshot of the build container, I essentially, like the snapshot of the build container along with all of its inputs or whatever, especially, and there's hashing mechanisms for that, recursive hashing mechanisms for that. You can say, hey, here is a unique identifier of all the things included in that build.
So I'm still not sure where that puts us with respect to the levels. Here, let me present what the current requirement. At level 1, we have identifies the artifact by hash. That's, I think, straightforward. Identifies the builder, straightforward. Identifies build instructions is level 1, and identifies source code at level 2, and the entry point at level 3. Does that make sense? Do we want to change it? I don't have a good sense.
I think we have
for what? I think that so if I understand correctly, I'm not really actually sure. Even what this build instructions is. Like, is this the build configuration? I feel like I wrote a lot of this text and I still don't understand it, which is not a good sign. Anyway, we don't really maybe have enough time to fully discuss decisions. A lot of people are dropping, but maybe that's something to think about going forward, of like what would make sense and what would be a good path. Like that could be incremental. Like if at level 1, if we don't even have a build service, what would be practical to list here? Is it practical to require to? At level 2, where there is a build service, is it okay to requirement right away? Or is that too difficult to implement?
I can take some of this as a takeaway to try and write up a proposal on some of the changes. It probably won't be like completely defined as like identifies build instruction should be changed to this, but at least the general things. Because yeah, I think it's a little unclear of where build, because I think that kind of goes back also to the thing that we had discussed another time of, if a build is a package build and the source of what you're actually building, like the OpenSSL Debian package versus the OpenSSL Red Hat package, right? There's a lot of things between what counts as source versus what counts as build instructions, especially if some folks are saying like, hey, here's our internal patches of the upstream source, stuff like that. And I think we might just need to draw a line in the sand of just keeping it generic, because there's no easy way to distinguish between them.
Sounds good. Could someone volunteer to recap the discussion on the better defined source issue?
What do you mean recap? In the notes or?
Okay, well, at a minimum, I'll mention on the issue that we discussed it here and link to it. And if anyone has the time to be able to comment on the issue, that would be valuable too. And then we'll have, I think the next step would be to actually have a concrete proposal, a pull request of actually defining this. Great. All right. I think we're out of time. Thanks, everyone. And I'll see you, I'll either talk to you online or see you next week. Bye.
Later.